From the City of Angels near the Pacific Ocean, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Noory. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, out-of-body experiences and night terrors. Here's what's happening. At least 6 people are dead. Search efforts still underway on the Hawaiian Islands as the influence of Hurricane Dora to the south of the islands and a strong ridge of high pressure to the north fueled dangerous wildfires there. Fire crews battled brush fires on Maui and the Big Island as wind gusts of more than 70 miles an hour helped spread the flames. One of the larger fires burning on the northern part of the Big Island charred more than 1,800 acres. Wow. A lawsuit has been filed against an Atlanta area hospital after a baby was allegedly decapitated as its mother was giving birth last month. Jessica Ross, 20 years old, went to the emergency room in the Southern Regional Medical Center in Riverdale on July 9th after her water broke at about 10 a.m. At 8:40 p.m., she was fully dilated and began pushing for the baby. The baby stopped descending because of a shoulder situation while being delivered, meaning the baby's shoulders could not fit through the pelvic area. Dr. Tracy St. Julian reportedly attempted to deliver the baby using different methods, including applying traction to the baby's head, and that's where they alleged the baby was decapitated. My gosh. After more than a year of gloomy forecasts for the U.S. economy, some experts have backed off the recession predictions and embraced the soft landing targeted by the Federal Reserve. Well, what does investment analyst Mish Shedlock have to say about this? Mish, what do you think?
I'm not buying it, George. Here's the exact quote. The odds of a recession in the next 12 months are highly unlikely. This is someone on CNBC's Council of Advisors, it looks like. The guy's name who said that was Ted Jenkins. We're seeing that kind of story all over everywhere. The people are predicting soft landing. George, I'm not convinced we're not in recession right now. So, and I'll get into my reason for that in just a second. But first, let's discuss some data that just came out in the last couple of days.
Okay.
The Fed had a review on bank credit standards and lending a few days ago. There's a 60% decline in the demand for commercial and industrial loans. That is a whopping decline in the demand for loans. And, of course, 60% of the banks are tightening their credit lending standards, making it harder to get loans. So it's, one side of the seesaw and the other, and there you see it. But today, Moody's came out, downgraded 10 banks, put another 11 on negative watch, and has another 6 slated for review.
Jeez,
probable downgrades on those. So this is going to feed on itself, George. And, these banks are already curtailing loans. Businesses want fewer loans because banks are demanding more interest rate from them. And now with these downgrades, that's a huge number, George. Banks across the board are going to be looking at these downgrades. They're going to be fearful that they're going to be in this next review, so they are going to cut the amount of loans they do. Now, back to my point, we might be in recession already. There's 2 measures of the economy, George: gross domestic income and gross domestic product. It's the latter that everyone focuses on. They should equal over time. Merchants produce products. We sum the value and the cost of all of those, and businesses and people working at those businesses get income from selling products, from working at those. The 2 measures should equal. Normally there's a small difference or a lag between them. Right now there is an enormous lag between them. The last 2 quarters of GDI, of income data we have, income was down 1.8% in the fourth quarter and 1.8%, in the first quarter of this year, 3.3%. It was down in the fourth quarter of last year. We don't have the income numbers for the second quarter, although we do have the GDP numbers, which look rosy, plus 2.4%, plus 2, plus 2.6, looking back at the last three quarters here. So we're going to see. The Philadelphia Fed, just to throw one more idea out here, has a measure where they look at GDP, either the product and the income. They mesh them, together, overweighted towards gross domestic income. And that number has been negative for two consecutive quarters. I went back and looked at the Philadelphia Fed data. In 9 recessions, all the way back to 1960, when their blended measure of income and product was negative 0.3% or worse, the country was already in recession. That's just on one reading, not two consecutive quarters, and we have 2 consecutive quarters of the Philadelphia Fed's measure stating we're in recession right now. So I'm not convinced we're not in recession, but if we're not, we're heading there based on what's happening with loans, George.
Talk to you next week, Mish. We'll see what happens. President Joe Biden has signed an executive order that will narrowly prohibit certain U.S. investments in sensitive technology to China and require government notification of funding in each tech sector. The long-awaited order authorizes the U.S. Treasury Secretary to prohibit or restrict certain U.S. investments in Chinese entities in 3 sectors: semiconductors, microelectronics, quantum information technologies, and artificial intelligence systems. Pope Francis has warned that artificial intelligence could pose a risk to society, highlighting its disruptive possibilities and ambivalent effects, and urging those who develop or use AI to do so responsibly. Howard Bloom, author of The Global Brain, with us. Howard, what do you think of the Pope's statement?
Well, here's the deal. In 1968, Pope Paul VI established a global peace day. It's a New Year's Day on which the Pope gives a speech reflecting the signs of our times. Today, the Vatican put out an announcement about the speech the Pope will give at next year's Peace Day, coming up on January 1st, just 4 months from now. The theme the Pope will zero in on is artificial intelligence and peace. The Holy Father's concern is that a logic of violence and discrimination does not take root in the production and use of artificial intelligence. And Pope Francis says artificial intelligence's rapid advance calls for ethical reflection. Now, the Pope is not alone in his concern about artificial intelligence. In March, Elon Musk said, "Mark my words, AI is far more dangerous than nukes." And Musk knows his artificial intelligence. Musk's Tesla cars use artificial intelligence for autopilot. Musk's SpaceX uses artificial intelligence to optimize the performance of its upcoming 100-passenger spaceship, the Starship. In addition, Musk has founded his own artificial intelligence company, xAI. Meanwhile, the New York Times reported on May 30th, 2 months ago, that leaders from OpenAI, Google DeepMind, Anthropic, and other AI labs warn that future systems could be as deadly as pandemics and nuclear weapons. Now, what are these AI founding fathers talking about? Among other things, they're concerned about artificial intelligence's weaponization. Last Friday, in the Ukraine war, where military innovation is happening at the fastest pace on the planet, an autonomous speedboat capable of racing at 50 miles an hour, traveling 500 miles, and carrying 1,000 pounds of explosives without a human captain, raced into Russia's biggest port, the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk, the home port of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and slammed into the amphibious landing ship Olenigorsky Gornya with 100 Russian servicemen aboard. The self-driving suicide boat rendered the landing ship useless, flooding one of its compartments and temporarily closing down the entire port. Said Russian TV personality Sergei Martin, the attack by Ukrainian marine drones on Novorossiysk is simply a quantum leap in the geography of the conflict. But this was just a preview of the future uses of artificial intelligence to kill. Russia, says the New York Times, has been testing autonomous tank-like vehicles. The U.S. Defense Department is experimenting with AI-piloted F-16 fighter jets that can fly in autonomous fighter jet swarms. Meanwhile, says the New York Times, the Air Force has a hush-hush program called Next Generation Air Dominance, under which 200 piloted planes will fly at the center of a swarm of roughly 1,000 drones. Meanwhile, Russia's working on electronic warfare systems that can target drone operators, then take them out with artillery shells. Beyond that, says Douglas Shaw, senior advisor at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, I can easily imagine a future in which drones outnumber people in the armed forces. James Johnson of the University of Aberdeen, in his book AI and the Bomb, writes that we are risking war turbocharged by AI-enabled bots, deepfakes, and false flag operations. Even worse would come if the autonomous AIs we train to kill our enemies turn against us. But the scariest part would be allowing artificial intelligence to decide when to launch nuclear weapons. AIs are famous for getting things wrong. They are famous for concocting fantasies that the experts call hallucinations. An AI having hallucinations and possessing control of nuclear warheads could end humanity.
So you think that Pope is justified in his concern?
He's justified, but there's a positive side. This stuff can be so good for us, artificial intelligence, that it's ridiculous. And he makes a very sensible call for looking at the ethical dimensions to protect us from tripping into the worst.
Howard, we'll talk to you next week as well. Thank you for that report. Well, as we've been reporting for years, watch out from the sun giving us an X-flare that could shut down the power grid. Well, listen to this one. The sun has been very active lately, sending out scorching flares and frying communication systems back here on Earth. The latest one was recorded late Monday when an X-class solar flare disrupted radio navigation signals across North America. We've been warning folks about this. Protect the grid. Here we go. In a moment, Maureen Seaberg back with us. We're going to talk about the incredible abilities of the human body next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you. Maureen Seaberg back with us. Expert blogger on the human senses. She writes also for Psychology Today. She's the co-author of Struck by Genius, How a Brain Injury Made Me a Mathematical Marvel with savant Jason Padgett. She has written for the New York Times, National Geographic, Vogue, and beyond. Ms. Seaberg herself has extraordinary sensory perceptions and experiences and is a super seer as well. Her latest work is called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. We'll talk about that right now on Coast to Coast. Maureen, welcome back. How have you been?
I've been well, George. How are you? Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be back.
Fascinating book. And how did you get so interested in the human ability to do these things?
I guess part of it is that I've been a sensory outlier my entire life. I am a synesthete, and I think you are too. In our last conversation, you mentioned you associate colors with numbers.
Yes.
So this is a doorway to super abilities, believe it or not. And many of the people I spoke to in the book can see extraordinarily well or smell, and they're synesthetes first. So it seems to create a hyperconnective mind so that people have enhanced senses. And it's so interesting to me, George, that you were talking to Howard Bloom about AI just before this.
Yeah.
Because perceptual laboratories right now, the places where scientists study the senses, are awash in all kinds of funding for AI, robotics, mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality. And it's created a real renaissance in studying human senses. And the irony is, the good news is, for all of us who have well-placed fears about technology, every time the scientists try to create sentience in artificial realms, which it's all about creating sentience, and they go to human beings to test our abilities to match or better them, humans are outperforming the machines by orders of magnitude.
That's dramatic. You know, we've all seen films and videos of police dogs running through the woods trying to scent the escaped convict.
Yes.
Are humans that capable as well?
We actually are. There have been studies where they've gotten research subjects, human research subjects, on their hands and knees in the grass and made them follow scent trails, and we can.
It's amazing.
So it's a myth that other animals can sense better than us. In laboratory settings, we outperform dogs in some things, rats in some things. And I'll tell you how this false belief came about. Not that we don't love our other animals. Perhaps this is more of a reason to be better stewards of them because we are supreme among them. In the 19th century, a neuroanatomist named Paul Broca theorized, incorrectly, that the human olfactory bulb, the nerve center where we smell, was smaller than other animals. It is not. However, in the game of telephone that is human history, this idea took off. It was the Victorian era. People wanted to separate us from the animals, make us not so sensual. Even Sigmund Freud picked up on it. And this myth has persisted until now. In fact, we are super predators. We reign supreme over all of nature. And I like to say, if you don't believe me, read the headlines, right?
All the time.
Yes, but we're using our power incorrectly, needless to say.
Maureen, the title of your book is called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, The Astonishing New Science of the Senses. But tell me about the Fearfully and Wonderfully Made title.
Yes, so I have my extraordinary editor, Elizabeth Disegard, to thank for that. Prior to her choosing that for the title, it was in the text of the book, and I had just revealed a whole bunch of new sensory facts, surprising ones, like humans can see light at the level of a single photon with our naked eyes. We can smell 1 trillion things, and so forth. And I said in the text, no matter your tradition, it's like the psalm that says we're fearfully and wonderfully made, which is Psalm 139. And it is King David talking to God and acknowledging how magnificent his human body is. And I love that they chose that for the title of a scientific book, because I'm all about metaphysics and physics coming together to better explain the nature of reality.
It's truly remarkable, the ability for the human body to do these incredible sensory things.
Oh, yeah. We are super sensors, all of us, in a latent way. I'm convinced.
Is intuition part of this?
I think it is.
Me too.
In Chapter 10, I profiled this extraordinary doctor, Neil Cease, who's one of the fathers of stem cell research and discovered the interstitium, the spaces between our organs that they used to think were just cavernous, empty spaces, and they now recognize as one organ that's fluid-filled and may be behind how cancer spreads in the body. But I bring him up because that gentleman is a synesthete, a super sensor, and has extraordinary intuition. As a medical doctor, when he is exploring something in his laboratory, he also uses his meditation practice, like Einstein would do a thought experiment and try to visualize what is going on in the human body. And time and again, this has been key to his amazing scientific discoveries.
Maureen, we're going to take a short break, but we'll come back and chat more about the incredible human body and its ability to sense out all kinds of things. Let's talk about that woman who can smell disease when we come back. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you, back with Maureen Seaberg. His book is Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, and her website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Maureen, who are some of the most talented sensors out there right now?
There is a woman in Scotland named Joy Milne. She's a retired nurse and grandmother, and she is working with scientists to identify Parkinson's disease, COVID, cancer, tuberculosis, all through the sense of smell.
Jeez.
She is a super smeller who can detect these things.
We've heard that some hospitals have had cats who can sense cancer, and they kind of cuddle up with the victim, and they know something's wrong.
Yes, dogs too, but people too. And, Joy explained it to me this way. The back of our neck running down to the middle of our back, there's a lot of sebum there, like an oily secretion. She calls it a sink. And she says so many scents on people are right there if we would only pay attention. And the way her abilities came to the fore is her husband started to smell differently to her. And at first she thought it was his long hours as an anesthesiologist. But even freshly showered, he smelled off. He smelled musky. 6 years later, he developed Parkinson's disease. And she started going to support group meetings for families and noticed that the people there smelled the same as her husband had. So she started to raise awareness among researchers. Thankfully, they listened to her. And do you know, George, thanks to her, there's now a swab test, a skin swab test for Parkinson's. And doctors can diagnose it 10 years earlier than before.
That's incredible.
It really is. And isn't it such an elegant solution? A woman who just can smell and loved her husband and cared what happened to him.
Can you enhance these senses, Maureen?
Absolutely. So what's really interesting is the senses are plastic. And unlike other forms of abilities like intelligence, they can be learned and grown. And in the last chapter of the book, called Vivify Your Senses, I walk people through 10 clear and enjoyable steps on how to expand your senses. And they include things like simply practice. Joy Milne, the grandmother who can smell Parkinson's, says smell everything twice. Just doing that will enhance your sense of smell. Another step I have is expect. All these new sensory potentials proven by science should change our mindset about our own abilities, and simply expecting these things in oneself and not denying them and acknowledging them and using the abilities will open you up even more.
Is science beginning to look at this?
Yes, very much so. And it is a renaissance, but it's not really declared or cohesive yet. Everyone is doing things out in their separate labs. But if you take a bird's eye view of it and talk to all of them, the things we're learning are just astonishing. For example, the eyes being able to see at the level of a single photon. So that work was done in 2016 here in New York City at Rockefeller University. And George, the implications of this are even greater than being able to see something that tiny with your naked eye. Because the next steps are They're going to see if humans can see entanglement and superposition with the naked eye.
What is that?
So we can see photons, right? We can see the smallest aspect of light, an atom of light. Can we see the activities of physics theorized by the greats in the past? Can we see two photons entangled with each other or in superposition with each other? Or are we going to see something completely different and rewrite the book on physics?
Heck, I need readers now to see close up.
You and me both. But you know what's interesting, George? The gentlemen, they were all men who were studied so far. They're going to bring women in later rounds. It wasn't intentional. But one wore glasses, one wore contact lenses, and they were still able to see this. So what they did was put their subjects in what is called a scotopic room. It's darker than dark. And they were in head braces, so their eyes couldn't move at all. And they were given a buzzer. And a new machine they invented shot single photons across the room, and they hit the buzzer if they thought they saw it. And they did. Even the folks wearing contact lenses.
Now, if they saw this, tell me the significance of being able to do this.
It means that we can actually see the fabric of things, that our eyes are so powerful, we are seeing an atom of light.
Wow. What about hearing and stuff like that?
Hearing is actually our most wide-ranging sense. We can hear from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, so it's like the bass of a nice stereo, the kind of sound that moves your pant leg at a concert, or the buzz of a mosquito. And these sound waves that we can pick up are also minuscule. They are smaller than the diameter of an atom. There is no machine on Earth who can match us.
Didn't the late Marilyn Monroe have some kind of ability?
Yes. So that was my and my professor's discovery at the Norman Mailer Writers Colony. I was up there writing my first book about synesthesia, and my professor called me and said, "You have to pick up Norman Mailer's biography of Marilyn Monroe." And I did. I ran out and got it right away and called him back, and he's like, this page, look what he says about her. And her first husband actually described her as a synesthete.
And explain what that is.
Yeah. So she had bonus senses, and the way he described it was she was like a lover of rock who sees vibrations when they hear the sound. And later I found Mona Ray Miracle, who is Marilyn's surviving niece, and was able to ask her about it. And she said not only was Marilyn Monroe a synesthete, but she is too. And it runs in families.
There were lots of them. You say Billy Joel was one.
Yes, Billy Joel has such a vivid case of it. He sees beautiful, colorful forms in the air when he's composing music.
And you say I'm one.
Yes. Well, the last time I was on the show, we got into it a bit, and you realized that you associate color with numbers, which is beautiful, really.
I don't know how I do that or why, but I do.
Yeah. Well, you know, George, they say we're all born that way. Isn't that interesting? And for some of us, 4% of us, like you and me, this pruning doesn't happen in the brain as it's growing. So all infants experience the world this way. But we continue to. And I wonder, George, if you have super abilities that go in with that. Like, do you have a very sensitive nose or palate? I know your hearing is extraordinary. because you're very particular about sound.
I really never thought about the other things.
Yeah.
And sometimes when it's natural, you don't realize that.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how we don't talk about these things? Because they're very personal, but it turns out they're key to so much. I mean, look what Joy Milne can do. And she can smell COVID. Would you like to know what COVID smells like? So you can run the other way?
I'm not sure.
It smells like apple cider plus infection.
That's not a very nice smell.
No, it's not. So we should be aware of that. And there's a lot more about that in the book.
What about people who sense death on other people?
Death?
Death.
You know, it's so intuitive that you brought that up because I was going to mention it next. A woman wrote to me today who had just read the book. The book came out yesterday. She read it the first day. And she said, Maureen, I have to tell you, before my dad got sick and died with pancreatic cancer, he smelled so different to me. And it really touched my heart that she shared that with me. And maybe this is a conversation we should all be having around dinner tables and in the top laboratories in the world. If we sense something is off in a loved one or in ourselves, we have to speak up because our equipment, my mentor, Bill Bushell, likes to say humans are soft tissue, high technology. Our built-in equipment is so much stronger than other animals and machines. And I believe the universe did that for a reason. And we're not using it yet, and we need to.
What about people, again, who have these abilities? And it's not just sensing through smell or stuff like that, but you can see auras, or somebody who doesn't have an aura, like Edgar Cayce had that ability.
Yes. So it's interesting because aura seeing, according to Dr. Jamie Ward in the UK, is a form of synesthesia. So now they can look at these things in fMRI machines and know that people aren't just being outlandish or seeking attention, that these are actual human abilities.
It's very powerful, isn't it?
It is. It is. And, you know, for some reason, George, we're conditioned to think that we're not special, that there's nothing extraordinary about being a human. Even our valorization of other animals over ourselves, like humans are so fond of talking about an eagle's vision, right, or a hound's ability to follow a trail. But we are all these things and more. And I'm so excited to think about a human future where we are the technology.
We could be artificial intelligence all by ourselves.
We are. My goodness, it came from our minds, didn't it? There must be a reason for that, because it's the way we work.
If people have these abilities, what do you recommend they do to make it work for themselves?
Well, there are ways to protect these abilities. So there are two things I recommend. In my last chapter, I talk about escaping. The wonderful synesthete Steve Roach is a Grammy-nominated composer. And he tells me in the book, you know, we have to have a sound diet in the way we are careful about what we eat. So there are good sensory things in the world, and there are bad sensory things like noise, for example. And it's a good idea to get away from it all and meditate in silence to protect your senses and enhance them. And another thing, George, this blew my mind. There's an EPA study from the 90s. It was a study that was done because of sick building syndrome, but it applies here too. North Americans and Europeans are spending more than 90% of their lives indoors.
Jeez.
Isn't that amazing?
Well,
and
right.
and it's very bad for our senses, because my counterpoint is these scientists looked at hunter-gatherers living in Malaysia. And I know that's very different than the way most of us live, but it's a stunning contrast. The folks they studied there living out of doors could identify many more colors than we can, could identify many more scents than we could. So here we are in our cubicles and our airtight houses, right? Just the senses are just atrophying. We should be outdoors more. So the two things in answer to your question that I think people can do for themselves is spend a lot more time outdoors, and when life becomes overstimulating, particularly with noise, go somewhere quiet, turn out the lights. We have to maintain